the shift that made outcomes inevitable. It didn't feel dramatic when it happened. No single decision marked the moment. No clear signal announced a change. Yet, once it passed, everything that followed felt strangely predetermined. To understand why this matters, we have to stop looking for turning points as events. Most outcomes aren't decided by shocks. They're decided by shifts, quiet changes in behavior that slowly remove alternatives until only one path remains. For a long time, the market appeared to have options. Moves could reverse. Pressure could dissipate. Uncertainty felt manageable because multiple outcomes still seemed plausible. Participants believed flexibility existed, even if conditions were tightening. The first reveal begins when flexibility started shrinking, not visibly, but behaviorally. Participants reacted the same way to different situations. Risk responses became standardized. Decisions grew more predictable. The market still moved, but its reactions began repeating themselves. The second reveal appeared in timing. Adjustments arrived later and later. Early intervention faded. Capital waited for confirmation instead of preventing imbalance. Each delay narrowed the range of possible outcomes. What once could have resolved softly now required more movement to settle. The third reveal emerged when effort no longer changed direction, only speed. Actions accelerated trends instead of redirecting them. Attempts to slow movement failed. The market wasn't ignoring information. It was processing everything through the same lens. Behavior had converged. This is the shift most people miss. When a system stops producing different responses to different conditions, outcomes stop being choices. They become consequences. At that point, price doesn't explore possibilities. It reveals inevitabilities. The market hadn't broken. It had committed. Committed not to a direction, but to a pattern of response that made reversal increasingly unlikely. The range of futures narrowed quietly until surprise itself became rare. From the outside, nothing looked final. From the inside, options were disappearing. And once a market crosses that line, the question is no longer what might happen next. It's what must. What followed would reveal how powerful that shift truly was, and why inevitability in markets is almost always recognized only after it's already taken hold. As that shift settled in, the market's behavior grew more consistent and more constrained. Reactions no longer surprised anyone. The same signals produced the same responses, regardless of context. What once felt adaptive now felt automatic. The conflict emerged in how little room remained for divergence. Participants still believed alternatives existed, but their actions said otherwise. Risk was reduced in the same way each time. Exposure was added only after confirmation. Capital moved in predictable waves. The market was still active, but it was no longer exploratory. Liquidity reflected this convergence immediately. Depth appeared where it always did. Support formed in familiar zones, then failed in familiar ways. Capital didn't argue a direction anymore. It waited for permission to join it. The system wasn't testing outcomes. It was reinforcing them. The tension deepened as repetition hardened into expectation. Each successful continuation validated the same response next time. Each delayed intervention narrowed the range of possible reversals. What once felt like patience now functioned as momentum by default. Institutional processes amplified the effect. Models recalibrated toward recent outcomes. Risk frameworks adjusted to what had already happened. Decisions became backward-looking, not anticipatory. The market was learning from the past in a way that constrained the future. Derivatives markets revealed the discomfort quietly. Skew flattened around direction. Optionality thinned. Traders weren't betting on alternatives. They were positioning for follow-through. The cost of being wrong in the dominant pattern fell. The cost of fighting it rose. The buildup accelerated as correlations tightened. Assets that once offered different paths now moved together. Diversification weakened. When behavior converges, variation disappears. And without variation, choice disappears with it. Veteran participants recognize the danger clearly. Markets become inevitable not when everyone agrees, but when everyone reacts the same way. Once behavior standardizes, outcomes stop being debated. They are executed. The market was still adjusting. but it was adjusting inside a narrowing corridor. And the next phase would show what happens when that corridor closes completely, when the system no longer has a capacity to surprise itself, and inevitability stops being a concept and becomes a condition. Because inevitability isn't loud, it's repetitive. The corridor narrowed further when pressure arrived that normally would have forced reconsideration. In another phase, it might have sparked debate, hesitation, or reversal. This time, it produced acceleration. Prices moved, and instead of resistance, they found cooperation. Participants reacted exactly as before. Risk was reduced in the same places. Exposure was added in the same phases. Liquidity appeared only after direction was clear. The system didn't pause to reassess. It executed the pattern it had already chosen. The conflict intensified as inevitability became visible. Attempts to counter the move failed quickly, not because they were wrong, but because they were alone. The market no longer supported alternative behavior. Acting differently carried immediate cost. Liquidity exposed the reality clearly. Depth aligned with direction. Support weakened precisely where it always had. Capital no longer tried to interrupt movement. It followed it. The market wasn't discovering new information. It was confirming an existing path. Institutional systems reinforced the process automatically. Algorithms increased exposure as thresholds triggered. Risk controls reduced positions in synchronized waves. Committees approved actions that matched precedent. Every layer of structure validated the same outcome. The buildup accelerated as correlations locked in. Assets that once offered escape routes now moved together. Hedging became less effective. Diversification thinned. The system had eliminated its own counterweights through repetition. Veteran participants recognized the moment immediately. This wasn't momentum. It was inevitability. Momentum still allows hesitation. Inevitability does not. Once behavior converges tightly enough, price stops negotiating. It travels until something breaks a pattern, or until the pattern exhausts itself. As the move extended, reactions grew faster, not more thoughtful. The market wasn't choosing anymore. It was executing. What once felt like trend now felt like gravity. That was a realization. The shift had already happened. By the time it became visible, outcomes were no longer forming. They were unfolding. The final phase would reveal what happens after inevitability completes its work, when the system finally arrives at the consequences it's been preparing for all along. Because inevitability doesn't announce itself at the start. It reveals itself when resistance disappears. When inevitability finished its work, the market didn't need to be pushed anymore. It arrived where it had been heading all along, without resistance, without debate, and without surprise. That was the climax. Not a dramatic break, but a quiet arrival. Price reached levels that finally released the pressure built by repetition. What had felt relentless suddenly felt complete. The system stopped accelerating not because it found balance, but because the path had been fully traveled. What unsettled many participants was how calm it felt afterward. No relief rally, no violent reversal, just acceptance. The market behaved as if it had known this destination for some time, because, in a way, it had. Every standardized response, every delayed intervention, every repeated reaction had been steering it here. Liquidity returned, but with a different character. Capital engaged selectively, no longer chasing direction, but evaluating consequence. Support formed with intention. Resistance gained meaning again. The market wasn't healed, but it was no longer trapped inside the same pattern. The resolution unfolded through recalibration. Behavior diversified slowly. Some participants stepped back. Others stepped in cautiously. Decision-making regained nuance. The corridor that had narrowed for so long finally opened. Not because conditions improved, but because inevitability had run its course. The deeper lesson became impossible to ignore. Outcomes don't become inevitable because of one bad choice. They become inevitable because choices stop being made at all. When behavior converges, alternatives disappear. And when alternatives disappear, the market stops exploring. It executes. Understanding this reframes how trends should be interpreted, not as direction alone, but as freedom. How many different responses still exist inside the system? How much disagreement is still alive? Because once disagreement fades, inevitability takes its place quietly. Markets are most dangerous not when they're volatile, but when they are certain. Certain in behavior, certain in reaction, certain in repetition. Because certainty narrows the future until only one outcome remains. And by the time that outcome arrives, the surprise isn't what happened. It's how long ago the decision was already made. So what do you think? Are markets still choosing their next move, or have they already removed every alternative except one? The shift